Okay, so here we are. When we left off in class, we were talking about the Battle of Gettysburg. We basically ended with saying it was the turning point in the Civil War. It was this sort of significant moment because the Union forces finally defeated the Confederacy. Confederates pushed back into the South, and it becomes fairly clear at that point that the war is going to end. It's probably going to end in a Union victory. The question is just how long is that going to take, and what sort of death toll is that going to ring up? By this point in the year, it's the middle of 1863. We're talking about a death toll of about 300 to 400,000 total men across the war. There's going to be 600,000 dead by the end of this thing. Somewhere around like 3 million people fight, 2 million roughly for the Union, a million roughly for the Confederacy, something along those lines. So you're talking about, again, a pretty high death toll. And the war is going to drag on again until April of 1865. So we still have another year and a half, year and 9 months roughly to go before this thing is actually over. And the reality is, gradually over time, all those Union advantages, superior technology, access to mechanization and military, like manufacturing, all of the superior manpower, just the number of people, all of that's going to take its toll on the Confederacy. And ultimately, they're just not going to be able to continue to fight this war. So we got to run through that really quickly here, talk a little bit about like the significance of the end of the war, things like that. So this battle at Gettysburg marks a significant turning point in the war, but it also changes a lot of the things that are going on back on the home front. It's the summer after the Emancipation Proclamation. I remember the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is in September of 1862, and then in January of 1863, January 1st, 1863, the actual Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, and we're going to see this change in the purpose of the war. Right, the war is no longer just about preservation of Union, as Lincoln had originally said, but now the war is also about the end of slavery, and what that would mean for the country. Obviously, is pretty dramatic, and as we sort of alluded to many times already throughout the course of not just this unit, but the semester in general, this old American mythology of like, oh, all these Northern people want to get rid of slavery and Southerners basically want to keep it is a little bit apocryphal. It's a little bit made up. The reality is that, of course, many Northerners don't oppose slavery. That's not necessarily that they favor slavery directly, but they don't really care if slavery goes away either. Some of them have significant concerns about it going away from economic and social perspectives as well. And so you're seeing after this initial Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863, significant rise in racial tension in the North. A lot of white people in the North, particularly working class white people, mostly in like major urban areas, big cities, New York, Detroit, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., places like that, they're going to see pretty intense violence between Black and white Americans as we see this persistent sort of like tension about what the end of a war that is now a war about slavery might actually mean. And a lot of times those tensions really result in what at the time would be termed race rioting, but I think would be more accurately entitled mob violence, right? Angry crowds of white people going in and killing Black people. And we see lots of examples of that throughout the war. There's an escalation of that after 1863 because of emancipation. In the prelude to the 1863 summer draft riots, you're going to see this sort of like persistent growth of violence in New York. New York, in part because there is a growing free Black population there. It's been there since before the war, and just to sort of continue to escalate. If you recall, and I know it's been a long time, but if you recall all the way back to the colonial period, the Dutch had offered this sort of like system of half slavery or half freedom, where enslaved people could be free as long as they continued to pay a fee for their freedom over the course of their life. And so that ends, right? That half freedom ends with full freedom for a lot of people, and ultimately a rising, again, free Black population. In Brooklyn, New York, we see the seeds of this violence when a group of white rioters come in, basically try to burn down this tobacco factory in which you see a lot of like Black women and children working. Railroad workers, longshoremen are people that are working on the boats, start attacking Black workers as well. So they just have sort of like this persistent rise in violence and no significant response from local law enforcement or the federal government to prevent it. And what that tells these sort of like angry white working class people is that they can get away with these sorts of acts of violence, right? That there's not going to be any repercussions for it. And so as the war kind of deepens and tensions around the war are going to escalate, you're going to see this massive draft riot begin. And the questions of why the draft even happens are a little bit difficult to deduce. As we've talked about a lot of times, Lincoln is a bit mysterious, if you will. Some might say manipulative. Nobody quite understands why he and Congress are pushing to implement the first draft in American history. The reality is, though, they are going to begin drafting all adult males between 18 and 35, and they don't draft everybody, but everybody's eligible for 3 years of military service. There's not really a shortage of manpower. There's not really like any great necessity for Union soldiers, despite the fact that after the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of Union military personnel have refused to continue to fight, have basically abandoned their military duty and gone home because they opposed the war about ending slavery, though they were willing to fight for Union. And so this tension explodes in New York, right? The theory behind why the draft even goes into place is that Lincoln and Congress are trying to encourage enlistment. If you enlist in the military, they would give you a bonus. If you get drafted, you don't get a bonus. You don't get like extra money. And so the general theory, the general perception is that they thought that by creating a draft, people would join as volunteers, thus not requiring many people to be drafted. And if people continue to die in this war, which is again now not about Union only, but also about eradication of slavery, then they'll be able to say, well, look, you may not agree with that, but these people who are fighting for it and dying for it, they're mostly volunteers. It's an all volunteer army or nearly an all volunteer army. So we don't have to have this national concern about it. That idea is actually an idea that we're going to see repeat in US history as well. And I'm going to avoid, as promised, a lengthy tangent here, but a short, relevant one. During the Vietnam War, as you probably know, there's this whole like anti-war movement, and we associate that with hippies and things like that today. That anti-war movement's primary complaint, beyond the fact that they just feel like the war in Vietnam is unethical and we shouldn't be killing a bunch of people, roughly 3 million Vietnamese people, to fight this supposed threat of communism, their complaint is you're forcing people to do it who don't want to. And so why should these boys who don't want to go to war be forced to die in a cause that they don't believe in? And the reality is the frustration and anger about the war and its purpose and the draft ultimately forced the US government to get out of the war. After Vietnam, the United States government kind of learns that lesson, and we move towards an all-volunteer force. This is usually where scared boys say to me, am I going to get drafted? And I usually say, it seems unlikely, because one of the key lessons the military has learned here and the government has learned here, not just from the draft riots, not just from Vietnam, but from other wars as well, is that it's very important to be able to say, these are volunteers. Right? These are not people who are being forced to fight in this cause. They chose this. And so if they die or they get severely injured, disabled, whatever it might be, experiencing psychological trauma, PTSD, all of those things, it's not that it's okay, but at least they knew what they were getting into. All right, so that idea of an all-volunteer army is really a key thing that's going to develop in U.S. history later. Anyway, back to the draft riot in 1863. It happens. The draft goes into effect. People are pretty frustrated about it. They're frustrated. Let's see if I can move myself. Does my face move? Oh, it does. People are pretty frustrated because they don't like what they're fighting for. They don't believe in the cause. They feel like they're being forced to fight for it. But in particular, there is this issue within the draft in the Union. And the Confederacy will also have a draft, but this issue does not exist there. In the Confederacy, if you're drafted, you're drafted. But in the Union, if you get drafted and you have $300, which is a significant amount of money, basically 2 years worth of wages for the average like working American at the time, you can pay your way out. You can spend $300, give it over to the U.S. government, and the U.S. government will basically say, well, you don't have to go. What this means now is that the sons of the rich, right, the sons of the wealthy, they are much less likely to get drafted, much less likely to fight and die in this war. And the reality is, of course, the abolitionist movement is mostly the middle and upper class. And so we have an ideological war about slavery that is supported by one class and not necessarily supported by the other, and yet a war that is being fought predominantly by the class that does not support its ideas, right? The working class who, in general, are going to oppose abolition or at least are apathetic to abolition. And so this sort of dual threat of the shifting purpose of the war to be eradication of slavery, not just Union, combined with the fact that the poor are the ones who see like they have to fight this war, causes a lot of anger in working class areas in the North, particularly in New York City, where you have a pretty large immigrant population as well. And so all of this sort of comes together as the draft is going into implementation. There are threats of violence around the draft all the way up into the run up to the draft. And remember, the draft goes like sort of law is passed in March, goes into effect several months later in July. And on July 11th in New York City, the first day of the draft, it's actually pretty peaceful. It's pretty calm. There's not really any violence. There's some protesting in the streets and a few people get beaten up, but like nothing major. Not that people getting beaten up is okay, but it's not huge numbers. The weekend goes by, and on Monday, they draw the second name of the draft. And over the weekend, basically working class people in New York say, you know what, we don't want this draft. And if they're going to continue to draft, let's protest, let's riot. And they ask people to put a candle in their window the night before Monday, July 13th, to indicate whether they intend to riot or not. And the working class areas in New York, in an area that is called the Five Points District of New York, that say that the lights, like every window, had a candle in it. The upper class areas of the city, because the city is very economically stratified, the wealthier class areas, they don't have that same tension. They don't oppose the draft. They're also often not as very aware of what's going on in these working class areas. So it seems very clear that these working class communities are about to explode. There's already tension there, not just about race, but also tension about immigration and nativism and all of these other issues as well. And so on Monday, July 13th, they draw the second round of names, and about 500 men from this firefighting company called the Black Joke Engine Company attack the draft office, this marshal's office, where they're carrying out the draft. We would think of that as odd today, firefighters being like public servants and hired by the government. It's not how firefighting works at this time. Firefighters are actually private companies. Hence the reason that firefighting agencies are called the firefighting company, whereas you wouldn't see like the police company, right? So firefighters at this time work for cash. If you can't pay, they don't put out your fire. They might put out your fire anyway if they think you're going to be able to like pay them in personal property, furniture, rugs, art, stuff like that. So these are not necessarily the most upstanding citizens. A lot of them are actually connected to like low level organized crime. Many of them are connected to like corrupt political people that are running the cities at this point in time. Stuff we're going to come back to more next unit with the Gilded Age, chapter 18 stuff mostly. So these firefighters, they get mad. They attack the office where the draft is taking place. They light it on fire. And then violence spreads across New York City. And basically what happens is these rioters start killing anybody they think is rich, these so-called $300 men, the men who might have been wealthy enough to pay their way out, and also randomly targeting free black men. And obviously, free black men have like nothing to do with this at all, but they are symbolic of the changing face of the war. And so you see sort of this wide-ranging violence carried out by the working class across the city. By that Thursday, 3 days of rioting later, there are several thousand federal troops in the city. The state militia was already called in to try to deal with it, and it was ineffective. The mayor of New York eventually asks the governor of New York to ask Lincoln to ask the military personnel who are at Gettysburg, the battle there is over, to come back and deal with the rioting. And so Lincoln orders some detachments of the federal army up to New York City from Gettysburg, and it just takes them the 2.5, 3 days to march there. As the federal troops arrive in the city, they basically put in a like stay-at-home order, and people that don't go to stay at home, they get shot. And so in the midst of this rioting, you have like all of the violence carried out by the rioters, compounded by all of the violence carried out by federal troops putting down the riot. 250 plus people are killed, 2,000 or so people injured, about 50 buildings burned to the ground. These are far and away the worst violent, most deadly and costly race riots, or not race, draft riots in American history. Nothing that happens during the Vietnam War is ever close to this in its scope or size. We do see like larger groups, 500,000 plus people protesting, but not with the violence associated with it. This is also happening a year before the next election. This shows just general discontent with the public about Lincoln and his policies. Hopefully you're reading chapter 15 and you'll read about how George McClellan, a former general, runs against Lincoln for president in 1864. Lincoln's pretty concerned that he might actually lose. Right? He worries that he's not going to be able to carry the working class vote. And black people can't vote at this time. They would have voted for him if they could, but they just can't. Lincoln ends up winning and he wins pretty significantly. Nevertheless, he creates a lot of concern for him about his future as well. So I think this shows us something really important. The North is not unified in this war, right? The North is not fully committed to this war effort. Not everybody there wants to see all of these things happen. And so, the draft riots are pretty violent. There is a really wonderful film that was made in the early 2000s about this general time period called Gangs of New York. It's much more focused on sort of like nativism, tensions between Irish immigrants and native-born Americans who don't want them here. It's really the plot point of the film. But the film itself it's like chronologically set in about the 20 years before the Civil War and during the Civil War. So if you ever get a chance, you may want to watch it. I think it's on, I just checked, I think it's on Hulu Premium and like the expensive Amazon Prime Video service. So if you have either of those, you might give it a shot. It's 3 hours. It's got all sorts of things teenagers love: violence, nudity, drug use. A typical Saturday for you guys. So, you go check that out sometime. We would have watched a clip of it in class if we had time. I will try to track down like some YouTube excerpts or something of it that you can watch if you choose, and I'll post them when I post this video, which means you would have already seen this. So that would be a silly thing. But if they're not there, it means I couldn't find it. So there you go. So despite this growing discontent in the North from these so-called copperheads, these peace Democrats, anti-draft men, anti-war people, 250,000 dead men, Lincoln is nevertheless invited to come down and speak at the Gettysburg Cemetery dedication. It's going to be a federal cemetery for soldiers who die in the Civil War. This is the speech that you read when I saw you on Tuesday. The Gettysburg Address is the speech he gives there. They ask him to do this like 17 days before the ceremony. He's kind of an afterthought. They invite the governor of Pennsylvania to come in and talk. He gives a really long speech, like 2.5 hour long speech, which is, you think I talk a lot, 2.5 hours. And then Lincoln is his follow-up to that. And this is where he gives, again, that Gettysburg Address, the 7 years ago speech, to a question that Ryan asked in class. Did he write it on a train? There's a bit of a debate about where Lincoln actually wrote this and how many drafts of it there really are and what he actually said, because there's no audio recording of it. We have a edited version of it, an actual physical copy of it that Lincoln allegedly wrote. And he talks about making notes on it and changing it around some on the ride down. Newspaper reporters have published 4 or 5 different versions of the speech. But you remember, they're all sitting there listening to him talk in a big crowd, trying to take notes on a piece of paper. So I don't know precisely what he said, but the gist of it is, of course, we have to continue to fight this war. We can't give up. And we have to remember that this is now a war about a greater purpose. It's about making real, reifying the promise of America, right? And ending that so-called American paradox. So a lot of people point to this and say, well, this is a moment that clearly shows Lincoln truly is an abolitionist. He wants the end of slavery. He believes in the cause. Again, I'm skeptical to that. I think he may indeed want that, but we don't really know. And of course, he is also cognizant of the fact that we've just had a terrible, terrible battle, and he doesn't want to lose civilian support from those like powerful abolitionist forces. And so how much of this is pandering to the abolitionists? I don't know. How much of this is an effort to address the fact that all of these people have died over the race riots in July? I don't really know, right? Like, it's just hard to figure out what Lincoln really wants out of this. Is it all political? Is it truth? We don't know, right? But regardless of all that, it's a really famous and important speech. There's one photo of him here. This is Lincoln, no hat. I know it makes him hard to recognize. He gives this speech in front of a big hotel and restaurant that he's basically staying at in downtown Gettysburg. If you go there today, you can actually visit the quote Lincoln that is there with, I guess, this Mr. Rogers looking guy. They put this up in the 90s. It was supposed to be like connecting the past to the present day and the common American understanding the power of Lincoln. The statue is allegedly at the exact spot, like where he gave his speech. Again, nobody knows precisely, but they know approximately where it is. So it's almost like one of the first things you see as you come into Gettysburg. It's almost a little silly at this point in time, but it commemorates obviously a really important moment. So if you ever get the chance, it's actually kind of a neat place to go visit, walk by Gettysburg. Another year goes by since the Gettysburg Address. Remember, that's November of 1863. By November of 1864, it again is still pretty clear the Union's going to win. The Southern will to fight doesn't seem to have been broken yet. It's not really clear like what that is going to take. By this point in time, Ulysses S. Grant, that general who got famous for his successes at Vicksburg, Lincoln has appointed him to be the head of the U.S. military. He's gone through a ton of generals by this point in time. Again, chapter 15 will talk about that a little bit more. But there's all these generals that he's just dissatisfied with for one reason or another. They think he's dumb. He thinks they're dumb. They're too slow. They're too lazy. They're too aggressive. What doesn't matter. They just don't get along. Lincoln doesn't like it. He's also frustrated that we don't seem to be able to win, right? And so he has put Grant in charge in the hope that Grant's exceptional success in the West is going to carry over to this eastern front of the war as well. And Grant is working with one of his other close generals, a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman. And they come up with this plan to finally, once and for all, break the Southern will to fight. By this point in time, a lot of the major urban areas in the Confederacy have been burned by Union forces, like Richmond, the capital. They're going to burn that in a few months. You're going to see like Savannah and Atlanta become targets in Georgia. Charleston is under attack. Mobile and Montgomery and Birmingham, Alabama have been destroyed. the war has taken a pretty devastating toll on the South, but the Union has sort of justified all this as military necessity. Grant and Sherman say, well, we just need more of that. And basically, what they want is for the first time, sort of a complete total war against the Confederate military and the Confederate civilian population. So they come up with this plan to go through the South, burning everything, like burning the fields, burning the livestock, killing the livestock, destroying plantation houses and plantations, torching the cities. They're trying to break the will of Southern civilians to continue to support the war effort because they believe that if they can do that, then the Confederate military will once and for all have to stop fighting. So this march becomes known as Sherman's March to the Sea, begins in November, ends in December of 1864. It's highly successful. They basically torch the whole place. They destroy a lot of the key infrastructure in the South. They rip up the railroads. They light giant fires under the railroad tracks, which is what you can see these logs are for. It causes the railroad tracks to melt. The Confederacy doesn't have the ability to make new ones, so they're basically stuck at this point in time. Enslaved people who are freed along the way get brought into the Union lines. Many of them start fighting for the U.S. military. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, allowed from that, which I'm sure you will remember. And so that also causes frustration in the South. Slaves in general in the South are very limitedly supervised by this point in time. Like virtually every able-bodied white male in the South is fighting in this war, rich or poor, it doesn't matter. They're all there, or they're serving the Confederate government. So the supervision of enslaved people has often fallen on the hands of like white men or white women, men with disabilities, enslaved people. And though they keep passing stronger and stronger patrol laws to require more supervision, there's nobody there to enforce those laws. And so enslaved people are basically just like walking off of plantations as the U.S. military approaches. Slave owners start to do this thing that they call, quote, running the Negro. They take their enslaved population and just like try to run away as fast as they can to escape the advancing military. Slaves run away in the middle of that process too. Enslaved people are also increasingly important to the Confederate ability to supply their army. So they're like driving wagons and going to town, like with no supervision. So they just walk away. The reality is, of course, what this means is slaves are critical to the war effort. Like the Confederacy can't hang on and fight without them, but also they're working everything they can as enslaved people to undermine that war effort. And so there's sort of like this duality to that experience. I don't think that College Board is likely to ask you to know anything about that. They might ask you to know Sherman's March to the Sea, right? The idea that it breaks the Southern will to fight. This leads to something that is often referred to as the Confederate dilemma. I am almost certain they will not ask you this. But what the manpower shortage in the South results in is laws that would allow the governments of Southern states or the Confederate government to impress enslaved people into military service and to do the same with free black men. And so they're going to force them into working for the Confederate government. Remember, Confederacy forms on the premise that sovereignty is key to the states and that property must be protected. And so a lot of these Confederates are very upset that their slaves are being used by the military without their consent and without compensation. And on the occasion that compensation is given, it's often not seen as enough. It's not seen as, enough money, enough compensation. And so it causes a lot of discontent in the South as well. But again, once again, enslaved people are essential. They're working now with the military, Teamsters, that's truck drivers, like driving wagons, mechanics, hospital workers, ambulance drivers, manual labor. I mean, they're doing like everything. And as the war drags on, the key dilemma that comes out of this is we're already using enslaved people in the Confederacy to support military efforts. Have we thought about arming them? Should we give them guns? Should we send them off into battle? And of course, most people in the South, I'll go back to that, think that that's a really bad idea. But the Confederate government does eventually pass legislation that would have allowed nominally for the arming of enslaved people under the promise that if they stayed loyal, those enslaved people would be set free. It never goes into effect, right? So the law is passed, they don't actually begin doing it. And again, I don't think it was really like that likely that it would have occurred. Everybody understands logically you can't arm enslaved people and ask them to fight to keep slavery. But they're desperate, right? And that desperation is reflected in the end of the war. By April of 1865, after Sherman's March to the Sea, after all this scorched earth stuff, after the continuing conflict for the next 2 or 3 months, General Grant, Ulysses Grant, and General Sherman, to a lesser extent, are basically trying to corner Robert E. Lee, the big Confederate general. This is Grant, by the way, all over Virginia. And Lee is just like running out of room to maneuver, and he is running out of soldiers. He started with an army of 120, 130,000 men, something like that. It's down to 20, 30,000 people. The Union military isn't shrinking. The Confederate supply line is breaking down. The Union supply line is not. Like, Lee's no dummy. He's a good general. He understands that he's lost. He understands that this war cannot be won. He goes to Confederate leadership, Jefferson Davis, the president, the Confederate Congress, and he says, like, we need to find an end to this war. This isn't working. We can't keep fighting. We're not going to win. And the Confederate government is sort of unwilling to do that. They're unwilling to accept that defeat. And so eventually, Robert E. Lee takes it upon himself to offer to meet with Ulysses S. Grant and talk about surrender. He is talking not surrendering the Confederacy so much as surrendering his military, but symbolically his branch of the Confederate military, his Army of Northern Virginia, that's like the name of his part of the Confederate military, is the thing that everybody looks at as, quote, the Confederate military. So they believe that if they can get this surrender, the Union can get this surrender of Lee, the rest of the Confederate forces will just collapse and the Confederate government will fall. And basically that's what happens. Lee meets with Grant and they agree at Appomattox Courthouse to surrender. Before we get into that actual surrender, a couple of things on data points. Like 1 million roughly people fight for the Confederacy. We have to remember the Southern white free population, adult male Southern white free population is just a smidge over a million, 1.2, 1.3 million. So when we say almost every Southern white man who's eligible and able to fight fights, that's what we're talking about. For the US, somewhere around 2.1 million people fight, about 125, 130,000 of those people are African American. That 2 million, that represents about 1/5, maybe roughly, of the free white male population in the North, maybe slightly less than that, 1/12, something along those lines. But for the Confederacy, again, it's almost everybody. And this is the deadliest war in American history, right? 620,000 Americans die in the Civil War. Obviously, we're killing each other, which certainly plays a role in that. And we think of the devastation of World War I or World War II. We have to remember the U.S. joins those wars somewhat late. We're not under attack as a country, whereas in the Civil War, we are physically fighting within our own territory, which certainly takes a toll on that as well. Wars like Vietnam and Korea, we kill millions of Korean and Vietnamese people in those wars, but it's relatively speaking limited death tolls in the United States. So certainly the deadliest war. The reality is a lot of those deaths come from disease and infection, not so much from getting shot on the battlefield. They actually differentiate in the death tolls between dead and killed. Killed are people that get shot and die. Dead are you died of something else. And that could mean you got shot and they tried to help you and you died 3 days later in the hospital. But you're still dead, not killed. A little screwy way of naming it out loud and separating it. But most people die from poor medical care, lack of medical care, the inability to deal with the wounds that people are having at this time. You're talking about at a time when if a bone gets broken by a bullet, it's shattered. They can't fix that. They're just going to amputate. And I think we talked about a little bit in class, they don't understand the germ theory of disease. They don't really understand that you could maybe infect somebody by using the same bone saw. These are all bone saws, these big ones, to amputate 3,000 people's arms all in a row without actually washing or sterilizing them. The other thing that they have to do, they realize, is get bullets out of your soft tissue. But they don't know where the bullets are a lot of times. So if you get shot in the stomach or something, they use these metal rods to dig around until they find the bullet. And then they have to spread the skin open with these pliers and then try to reach in and grab it out. I mean, it's just devastating to people who are experiencing it. So a lot of people die from that. A lot of people die from disease. There's, again, no sterilization of the wounds. They don't even have anesthesia for a lot of the soldiers. For commanders, high-ranking officers, they will give them opium. They might give them alcohol. Not a great thing to do when you're going to give surgery to somebody to thin their blood with alcohol because you bleed out faster, but they do it anyway. Chloroform, things like that as anesthesia to knock you out. If you're just an infantryman, they're just going to have your buddies hold you down and they're going to start cutting. And a good doctor can cut off a leg in a minute or less, but I mean, the shock and trauma of that is overwhelming. So, the Civil War has that pretty devastating effect on the civilian population as well. After the war, all these men who fought are severely wounded, many of them psychologically traumatized. A lot of these guys are going to become the cowboys and the criminals of the Wild West because they're trying to escape civilization and urban areas where they don't feel comfortable and they don't feel understood. They also become opium addicts. They're prescribing opium as a significant painkiller. There's an estimate that somewhere around 1885, 1890, 1 in 10 American men was an opium addict. It's just a crazy high number. And if you're opium, I don't quite remember that. Remember, opium becomes heroin. So talking about highly, highly powerful, highly addictive painkillers. So, there's a lot of those medical consequences as well. Nevertheless, with all that going on, Lee agrees to formally surrender on April 12th at Appomattox Courthouse. As I mentioned on the day where I rambled on and on about Fort Sumter and did 4 slides in an hour, because crazy, Appomattox Courthouse surrender occurs 4 years to the day from the attack on Fort Sumter. Again, not coincidental. This is like intentional. It's planned. Lee and Grant agreed